My name is Tom Mackie. I have been in museums and public history and in academic teaching for about 41 years now. My favorite class to teach has been U.S. Survey, but because I worked at several Civil War sites and museums.
Hello and welcome to Obehi Podcast. I'm your host, Obehi A14, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode.
I have been involved in the antebellum history, kind of fairly early American studies, more often than other areas. And Frederick Douglass, the content is kind of one of my favorite characters that I began studying sometime back when I was first having to look into antebellum life in America.
Thank you so much for that. I appreciate that. I really do. So today we are talking about somebody that is very important in the history of the United States and in the history of African Americans. So the person of Frederick Douglass is absolutely very important for us. So thank you for taking the time to explain who this individual is. It's a series that we call Life and Legacy. So we're going to start with a little description of him. Who is Frederick Douglass?
Best way of describing him, I would say Frederick Douglass is the epitome in America of the self-made man. He identified himself this way. He is an activist. By using modern language, we'd say he is an activist. He's a professional activist. He spends almost really his entire enslaved life activating or promoting and protesting for the status of African Americans in the United States. But he does so not only in the United States, but throughout Europe as well. He's kind of one of our early celebrities. He was basically internationally renowned in this world of activism, not just in abolition, but temperance and women's rights as well.
Thank you so much for that. This is why we love history so much, because it gives us a chance to be able to dig into our past. It was something that have happened in the past, so we can sort of reconnect, because it is very important for us to connect. And that is the essence of life anyway, because if we are just here now, we think that the life we are living is just all about this moment, and we are missing something because we don't even know where we are standing. But if we can manage to recollect, to know where we are coming from, it helps us to make sense of what we have today, and therefore project even into what is going to be happening in the future. So I love history. I love it a lot. So now let's go to the basics. What do we know about Frederick Douglass as a young child growing up?
He's born, I believe, 1818. He is born enslaved. He never knew his parents. He only remembers his mother up to about the age of 6. The enslaved world, even in Maryland, which is right around the D.C. area where he was born, though that area where he lived, born into, it was common for many enslaved boys and girls not to really have any connection with their parents. They would be farmed out to other places, raised by someone else. Sometimes families broken up were a common problem. So Douglass never knew his father. In fact, he suspected that his father biologically was one of the masters who raped his mother. He does not know his mother except that by age 6. He knew a grandmother, and he's somewhat raised on his own on different plantations around where he was born. So that's his origin story. Now he goes at length until his teen years, when he finally makes his escape from slavery.
Now a curiosity: why was somebody else needed to raise him? Why did the mother not raise him at the time?
You did not own your own body. The African American slave did not own themselves. The Americans had grown a form of chattel slavery, which equated a human the same as cattle or horses in legal codes. It was a divisive, it was an explosive political issue, moral issue, social issue, but it was one issue that Douglass was simply grown up in. He would spend his entire life from the time he starts, leaving work going into activism to prove and document that he is an example of a man who is has been enslaved, but is more human and or as human as anyone else of any other color, and has the capacity intellectually, morally, to participate in the social world on an equal footing. That is his life goal. He would spend that before the Civil War, after the Civil War, and that is kind of his core message throughout his life, even the many writings and speeches he gave.
All right. Now, help us understand the United States of Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass at this time that we're talking is still a young man.
Right.
He's still not, okay, he freed himself when he was 10 years old, you said, right?
Right. If he freed
Okay.
himself,
Yeah, tell me, how was the United States at this time? Give me a picture, something that we can look at.
the United States, when people will talk about it, people living here would say, they would use the word the United States are. They would not say the United States is. Because since the founding, even in the colonial years, but particularly after the Revolution, 1790s, 1800s, the United States political structure formed and coalesced around the economies of the states. Were they based on a slave system? Were they based on a free labor system? That became one of the bigger dividing lines. The slave system would define culture, it would define religion, it would define even your sense of belonging and purpose in life. Were identified by whether or not you were part of that system. When Douglass talked about it, he said slavery, among its worst sins, is not so much the cruelty, but that you are unable to be a person. The personhood is removed within the slave system. This is what is often ignored, and what we call neo-Confederate, retelling of it. You are no longer a person; you are a thing. You are a piece of property in this system, and so cruelty is a matter of course. It doesn't. That's what's court, but it happens to be. America is divided among those functions. So 1820, 1830, 1850. These are crisis moments between the end of the War of 1812 and the Civil War, where Congress is going to have to come together and make a compromise, whether it be over states, whether it be over tariffs, but slavery is going to be at the bottom of this piece, somewhere in the mix of this political compromise. And each time those come up, almost every 10 years, each of these comes up, the U.S. nearly collapses or shatters into pieces. There are threats of civil war in 1820, 1830, 1850. Each of these moments, there was a crisis moment, and congressmen, senators come together, able to compromise, but the compromise has always been at the expense of continuing slavery deeper and deeper into the social network. By 1858, here's America. Every single Protestant church, this is a dominant religion here, every single Protestant church has split. And the core issue for their splitting is over slavery. And this is before secession movement has taken effect. Old senators like Henry Clay were terrified to realize when the Methodists split in 1845, if the Methodists, the biggest church in America, can't hold it together through the slave debate, what chance do the rest of us have? And so many could see this coming. Many could feel this split coming. They would work out compromises. And so news, the various commentaries people would make, editorials, this is going to be in a lot of people's minds. And there are other issues as well. It's not as simple as that, but many who work in government or watch politics closely at this day and age could have seen this, did see this, and often talked about this sense of a doom kind of coming up, with this sense that this is not going to go well. This is, in fact, Edward, there were some politicians, Seward had said, he called it the irrepressible conflict. I don't see any way this is going to end well. That's a modern version of saying it, but basically the irrepressible conflict, I don't know how we're going to get out of this. Use a modern analogy.
Thank you so much for that, dear Thomas. I appreciate that. Now we are talking of the United States at the time that Frederick Douglass was still a young man.
Mhm.
And you use the term split, of course, between the churches there, and of course within the society, as it were. What do you mean by split? Split in what? What were the positions that people were actually split on?
Well, the one I'm best familiar with, Baptists would do it later on, but the Methodist Episcopal Church, theirs is a very obvious one. The general like an annual conference, national annual conference of the Methodist Church argued that because slavery is a moral wrong at root, despite the facts being legal, it's morally wrong. They argued we cannot ordain a minister who is a slaveholder. You must, if you have been a slaveholder, to be a minister, you must, or an elder, you must remove slavery from your life. You cannot be a part of that. Southerners rejected this outright. The church literally over that core issue split. Now the Methodists would split 2 more times because many in the North felt that that wasn't radical enough. The Free Methodists, for example, split in 1858 because they wanted such a hardcore anti-slavery stance that even the Methodists could already split, weren't aggressive enough on this issue. And so there are issues like anti-Mason movement. This is also a big one. That tends to be also the evangelical or really radical Christians. I use the word radical because these are those who are taking the gospel message very strong about all people are equal. And they're very aggressive about this one. And that is not a message a lot of people can really handle. We're still pretty much a society with a bit of a class consciousness. And it's not going away. I mean, we don't talk about class consciousness. We don't really, use the words. But when you look at Victorian society or not Victorian, but antebellum society, you see class consciousness. You see if you're an immigrant, Irish immigrant, you see if you're Catholic, you're not one of us. You're a different class, not just religion, but class as well. So with us, class and race and ethnicity have always been wildly mixed up. And that's the world that Douglass comes into. He becomes really well known, I think, by 39. Well, he begins speaking in 1839 when he meets William Lloyd Garrison of the Abolitionist fame, and he's kind of mentor to Douglass. And Douglass, because this is personal history. When they meet, he gets Douglass and puts him in front of an auditorium and says, "Tell me your story." It's like use a modern analogy, Garrison's podcast, put him on camera, get him to tell your story in your own words. So Douglass, by the 40s, becomes well known because here is this man who has escaped slavery, and he's self-taught. Americans we love the self-taught idea. We are all self-made people, men and women who make themselves. We are so big about this. That is such a big popular image. It's cultic, literally. It's a cultic image in America at this time. And Douglass is hip. He's as bad as Lincoln. He's equally as bad as Lincoln in being self-made. But Douglass discovered that he's good at public speaking, and he's developing skills in writing. And as a 26, 27-year-old, he goes to England. He sent over. Now, remember, the man is not earning any income on his own now. All right. He can't work on board ship like he used to. He can't do any of the labor work. He's speaking. So he is living off fees from speaking engagements and off the abolitionist underground movement. The abolitionist has basically a whole economy underground, not traceable, because they're paying for all sorts of things that are not technically legal. So Douglass, who's still a slave, still wanted, is now in England by, I think, 46, and he becomes a hero over there. I mean, Scottish kids are singing heroic songs about him at this little kirk in Scotland, this little town in Scotland. The Irish revere him. Only some do. Some don't like him well because Douglass is he's a 27-year-old. He's kind of arrogant, I suppose. And he takes offense pretty easily. I think there's a lot of misunderstandings when people talk with him. They don't know each other. They're coming from different worlds, very different worlds. So misunderstandings are going to be real common. But Douglas becomes quite a hero. In fact, it's the English Abolitionist Society, which formally buys Douglas's freedom. I think in 48, in the late 40s, 49, something like that, they actually buy his freedom. Now they find his old master and says, look, you're not going to get him back. You'll never, you want to make some money? Here it is. Free him. Give me his papers. End of discussion. They're buying him off, basically. So before 1850, Douglas does become free. But things become really dodgy in 1850 with the compromise then, because it enforces a nationwide fugitive slave law with real teeth. And we've always had a fugitive slave law, but all of a sudden in 1850-51, that fugitive slave law becomes, iron core. And so a posse from Virginia can go up to Michigan or Wisconsin, and they can draft locals to hunt down those who escaped. There will be no trial. There will be, this is basically, they identify you, they'll drag you back. If they think they identify you, they'll drag you back. You don't have another option. And so Northerners become militant, not because they're unracist, but because they really don't like people telling them what to do.
All right.
That's the world he comes in.
Thank you so much for that. So you did make mention of one individual who sort of mentored him.
Yeah.
I think that is what we want to spend some time here, because we are not born with all the characteristics. Sometimes we do have some of the characteristics, but until we form them, they cannot help us. Now we see that Frederick Douglass is able to make his way, not because somebody was actually putting money on him, but because he was able to speak. His ability to speak is now making way for him. Which means somebody have helped him to either find this gift inside of him or help him to develop it. So who are these influencers that are helping to find his way, that sort of influence him? Yeah, let me put it that way.
All right, several. Of course, Garrison, who is a renowned abolitionist. Now, by 1850, he and Garrison will have a really ugly falling out, and they will never even talk to one another again. But Garrison shows him the way and sets him up on stage. Garrison is his manager, so to speak. So Garrison's big, and Garrison is a public speaker. He's a bit of a radical, but Douglas also comes out of the Black church. And so Douglas also has that influence. Preachers who read the King James Bible. Now, Lincoln's big in this one, and you have to remember, this is an influence. It's maybe not one person, it's multiple people, but it's the language, the analogies, the metaphors in particularly the Old Testament of the King James Bible that are going to be very, very influential. You're going to hear or read Douglas's comments in almost every speech or every writing, every book he puts out. You're going to see references to a prophecy, to the King James, to the book of Exodus, to something in the King James Bible. That particular language, even the pacing of how he says things, is going to be from that. And then there's a woman called Julia Griffith. I'm saying her name right. Julia is an English activist herself, abolitionist. I don't know her age necessarily, but she's probably about Douglas's age. But she is also a very well-educated woman, and she actually, while in England, joins up with Douglas's group, and she comes back to the United States. Now, she is the editor. Now, if you've ever written something, if you have an editor who works with you, like my wife has edited some of my things, and her favorite phrase is, "Are you sure you wanted to say it this way?" Are you really sure? Because here's what it sounds like, And so, oh yeah, that sounds kind of crappy, doesn't it? Yeah. So she did that for Douglas. Now she is a master of English language. So she understands grammar and construction, connotation versus direct language. She understands these things. Also, being in England and with her as your coach, he is no longer speaking as a Southern kid who has learned to speak on the plantation. He doesn't use dialect. He doesn't use a poor English the way that many slaves would be forced to use, because if you're enslaved, and I discovered this really hard with good friends of mine down there, and I never discovered it's still in some areas of the South, is that if I got to know a friend within the African American community, and when they learned to trust me, I would see the real them. Whereas before that, they would never tell me what they really thought. And if you're in this kind of environment, this world where you are at threat all the time, you learn to show a certain face, a certain expression, and you use a certain language that is safe among that group. That's what they learned to do to survive. That was survival technique, and it was very universal. Douglas had to unlearn that and learn to speak, perhaps even with an English dialect, because Julia is coming from an English dialect, so he might have developed this posh dialect, the received English he might be using, and it throws Garrison off, because you're not the kid I knew. She says, no, I have grown, and Douglas is the man has to grow. He demands to grow, and he demands everyone else around him to grow. This is very big with him. This is age. And so Douglas, she is very influential in his writing. I think probably his writing particularly, because she is drafting how he says things, and he becomes a writer. And this is a big thing for Douglas. Here is this guy born in slavery who is before the Civil War, he is a renowned writer. Not just a speaker, but he is a writer. And he rewrites and he uses words to change his personal image with others as well. So that's part of his message. And so they have her is big. I believe his wife, Anna, is very influential. Now, she never becomes his first wife, Anna. They met in Baltimore. She's a free black. She is, I think, part of that support group. And these are people we often don't know how they support us, but they're the ones who keep us real. And I think she is the one who kept Douglas real, kept his feet anchored to something. That is part of that influence that it's hard to really put your finger on, and perhaps it's not as popular, but that kind of family support is very big with Douglas. I think because that is what is taken from you in the enslaved community. You don't have a chance to actually be dad, be mom. You are not a daughter or son. You are property. And so Douglas takes those things, and those are influential to finally live, unlike his mother and father, or anyone else he knew when as a slave child. He has the ability to now take on the role as husband and father. And that is influential, particularly since he has not had that in his, or any example of that in his young life. So that's a strong influence as well.
Thank you for that. Now, this idea of looking at a human being like property, which may have been practiced for a long time during the enslavement period, can we say that it managed to make its way into the current society, the United States of 2023? Is that possible? Say something about it.
Ooh, it's hard. Douglas has come back in more recent decades, I think. In America, especially in the modern world, we talked before about public history. And I think people like Douglas, their influence time as a celebrity really, he's a celebrity all through the time when he dies in the 1890s in Rochester, New York. He's always a celebrity and well-known. Huge, he's well-known. He's epic. And so time passes on to keep the message alive. Douglas's works are often republished and people can be exposed to them. What happens a lot in our world is we go back and reread. In fact, my wife, when I was doing Civil War research, oh goodness, almost 30 years ago now, she read Douglas's autobiography, and her comment was, we have got to remember him again. This needs to be the voice. If you want somebody to critique racism, this is the voice you want to use. He is precise. He is exacting. He's razor sharp. He's not gentle, but he is sophisticated. He is the voice of ration and reason. He makes a solid argument that is it's very difficult to resist, and that needs to be heard. Not the screaming, not the howling, but the rational argument, almost like an Old Testament prophet, like he sounds like. That's the voice you want to hear because it is tough, it is hard, but it's also rational and it makes sense. He's using real words. He's speaking both to the heart and the mind. And I think, yeah, I think some recent books have helped bring Douglas back. And I think even since the 1619 project comes out and other projects where we start arguing these cases come out again and this is not necessarily in a rational way, but Douglas gets pulled back in. And I've seen some actors portraying Douglas in a wonderful way. In fact, I heard James Earl Jones recite Douglas's speech. I go, oh yeah, that's the voice you want to hear. That's the voice that it had this basal voice that just, I think Douglas did have a big bass voice. And he's probably the only match for Lincoln in public speaking.
Now, let's look at just briefly, then we'll move into his story more. The mindset, the thinking, the idea that some people are just property,
Mhm.
as it was in the case of Douglas or at the time when he was born. Can we say that that mindset, that mentality has managed to make its way into the current United States of today?
Oh, get me in trouble here. Yeah. Uh, my first background in geography, we often argued or looked at patterns historically, and we'd find them in physical things. People who grew up in a certain kind of home, for example, a certain kind of lifestyle, kept that going over generations and over space and movement. Ideas are the same way. It's like a cultural blueprint. We don't break it down that easily. Slavery came in slowly. 1619, for example, Jamestown, they were indentured, but not like other indentures. By the 1660s and 70s, we have true slave codes that are based on race. That sets a pattern in colonial law that's going to be copied by younger colonies throughout the United States, what would become the United States. The build up of slavery as the economic powerhouse of the United States by 1810, 1812, cotton. And so slavery becomes this economic engine. As we heard in informers during the Nixon Watergate issue, follow the money. There's huge amounts to be made. When you had that kind of investment, you have honor, you have your personal reputation, you have everything tied in to this system. It becomes your identity. So America becomes identified very strong as a slave economy, because almost like you don't dare cross it. It's the third rail you can't touch, and yet it's being touched. And so you have that very powerful honor code built into it. You cannot challenge it without great risk. There are fights in Congress that go into this issue. So this is a tough, hostile issue. And one of the compromises is simply, well, let's go ahead and move everybody out. Just any of the enslaved become free. Let's send them back to Africa. Well, Douglas commented on this. He hated colonization. He hated it. He said, I've been here longer than you have. My family came here before yours. He argued with them because he said, you have no right to send me out. I'm not African. I'm not Nigerian. I can't speak any language in Africa. I don't know the languages. I may have the complexion, but I don't have the language anymore. I don't know the culture. I'm American. I'm 6th, 7th generation American. And so he argued, you're going to have to live with us. That's it, baby. You must live with us. So getting away from that pattern is not easy, because there was still the other part that said, you're not really one of us. Or if you're kind of one of us, as long as you're a comfortable part separation. When I lived in the South, I recognized this, that there was this comfort level if the different societies of Black society and white society lived near each other, but separate within some kind of a safe emotional distance. When you start demanding equality on a true social level, that becomes dangerous. You cross the line. Douglas, and I can't remember this date now, 18, he remarried a much younger woman after his wife had passed. Helen Pitts, her name was, and she's an activist. Loved Douglas. She really admired Douglas, but part of their marriage was a protest. He's white. And their marriage caused a marvelously huge scandal that just went everywhere. And it was in many ways to challenge the continued race segregation culturally that we had. In Douglas said, economic, political, and social equality must be there. And so to marry her was a way of casting and trying to force the issue in many ways. I think it seems to me this was a love match as well, but it is a political match, strange and awkward way. But because they touched the social mores of that time period, they are critiqued, and that probably maybe even why maybe Douglas was forgotten for a while or ignored for a while, because that's just a step too far for so many people. And I remember my own parents, being concerned over that back in the 60s. Just, well, if a white girl and a Black guy get married, or vice versa, who's going to be their family? Who's going to accept them? Because we lived in a segregated world in the North, and it's really hard to put those together properly. Where, dude, you're people, lighten up. I've seen a lot of hope in that one, but that's I saw that that kind of segregated society not even 60 years ago. That's not that long ago. That really is a short time. So those formats, those structures, those behaviors, cultural patterns, the way we interpret law sometimes, those are all kind of embedded in there. And I think bit by bit, they have to be pulled out. And that's what we're facing right now, bit by bit. And not always, and we're not doing it particularly well or easily. Sometimes those have to be pulled out, but somebody to define what they are. Is it in land use? Is it in simply a perception? Is it a prejudice? What is it that keeps our societies somewhat separate? Is there something else that has to be done? And those are not easy questions, because, as I like to say, there's baggage. Meaning there's emotional baggage in that one. For the family, of the African American family, there's baggage, there's anger, animosity of past treatments. Grandpa's stories about this. The history of lynchings. Those are not that far back. That really aren't that far back, as we like to imagine. No, they're not. That's close. And we look at the issue on the United Kingdom. I mean, Irish and English have been at a deep hatred for one another for 600 years. So, the cultural grudges do not get healed easily.
I like the term that you use, because I want you to explore it a little bit further. In that you said they are not one of us. Of course, that is how the people see people of African American, people that are different from a certain group of Americans who believe that they are the real Americans. So when you use terms like that, what is it supposed to mean? That the people that are real Americans are just one group of people? If you are maybe the indigenous American, you are not a real American. If you are coming from China, you are not a real American, even though your parents have been there for many years. If you are coming from Africa, you're not a real American. So I want you to expand on that a bit.
That was tough, because who are you talking to and where are you standing? Men like Douglas, in fact, in the 1880s, when the Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, he protested this. because you're keeping out another group of people seeking a different life. And so he protested this thing because you did it to me. He protested the very act of doing anything that would keep others out because they are judged different. He says, we're all different, for pity's sakes, so we have a long history, in fact, dealing with Native American, even the indigenous peoples. Now it even gets worse. If you're looking for a listing of bad behaviors of, the genocide of Native Americans is worse. That one is much more conscious, and it's embedded, beginning with early English colonization practices, and then as America grew and became very land hungry, that practice gets much more dominant when we get into the 1800s, until it kind of hits this ghastly climax in the 1830s under the Jackson administration. This is a point where it becomes really depressing to study U.S. history. Now, the one value is that there are groups of people, political parties, churches that are vehemently opposing this. They vehemently oppose the treatment of indigenous peoples like in this way. They are, hostile, and yet do not have the votes to change Congress. There is enough of a majority, and because of the unified Southern system defined by slavery, that again makes their position, their personal interest dominate Congress. The areas, our history kind of goes that direction. It follows Southern interests throughout the 1830s, 40s, into the 1850s. In many ways, the Civil War, because it's tied to slavery, is also about Southerners losing that ability to control national interest in their favor. Real America, we use the word, if somebody uses the word, or whenever I hear the word real American, I question that. What do you mean? I want to poke down. What do you mean real? Because we're a composite, and this is an argument what Nahum made. We are a composite. Even by 18th century standards, we are a composite. Yes, they kind of look more like Germans, Irish, Scots, English, French, Swiss, Nords. They do tend to look a little bit alike. However, by the 17th, 18th century standards, they were very different. We should, and I use that word carefully, have formed some identity, by the 1780s that said, okay, look, we have a lot of different people here. We just are going to keep growing different. In fact, many of the founders, like Jefferson, he knew there would be Muslims coming in. In fact, there already were people of Islamic faith here. They were from Africa. Many of the enslaved were Muslim, coming from Africa. So there, we had enough of a Jewish community to become notable. So we had others here who were Protestant. When in the past we used the word real American, they tended to mean somebody from an roughly English background, Protestant background. And I use that word loosely, meaning they were definitely not Catholic and definitely not Jewish, but vaguely Protestant. That becomes the definition. The former American Party, it's called, used the term real Americans. And because they became known as the Know Nothing Party later on, probably because they said, they don't have any policy, they know no policies at all, don't know any policies, but their policy was to limit some kind of creation of a limit of immigration or voting rights just to those who they thought, and I use the word carefully, were real Americans. And they did not, of course, they would not consider indigenous peoples real Americans, certainly not any African Americans. And if you were of Jewish faith or Muslim faith or Catholic, they also would not consider that. In fact, we've had riots over just which translation of the Bible do we use? Philadelphia was racked by called the Bible riots in the 1840s because of Catholics, kids would not use a King James Bible. That's a Protestant Bible. Well, then bring your Douay translation. It's English. No, that's a Catholic Bible. It's not real. Oh my God. So in looking at it from this time period, I shake my head, but then I realize, no, I grew up with this. I kind of know what's going on, and it horrifies me to realize, oh, I had this my own background. Crap, I'm not innocent either. It's a very hard way to look, and it's really painful to do it. But if we make any progress at all, that has to be hung up to dry. And every generation has to realize, okay, here are the awkwardnesses, and I use that, here is the really embarrassing points of our past. This is what each of us has got to get past. We have to, and you can't not pass by saying, well, that's in the past, it doesn't matter anymore. That's what we hear a lot. I hear people say, well, no, stop that. You know better than that.
All right.
You
Thank you
know
for
better than that. Sorry, yeah.
I appreciate that. I appreciate that. Yeah, we're talking history. Of course, we are talking about the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass. But for us to understand who Frederick Douglass really is, we need to understand also what he did. And for us to be able to understand what he did, we also need to understand what is the context, what is the situation where he found himself that is reacting to. So that is why I ask you those questions. I'm going to ask you the last one, then I'm going to move into some other things specifically to him. Now, this is a kind of a curiosity of mine.
Okay.
In that, now, because the people, like you already explained, who believe that they are the real American, they are actually nothing more than extraction of European, also a certain extraction of the European, the English specifically, the Irish. Now, let's pretend that all white people are European. And let's pretend that all the white people are the real Americans. They are the only American. Every other person is an immigrant or is a foreigner.
Okay.
Now, this is my question. What do this group of people stand to lose if the United States was to function as a country by the Constitution even, where everybody is equal before the law, where everybody is accepted to have been created by God in the image of God and therefore should be treated equally by the law? Let me understand that.
Yeah. William Johnson, English philosopher, made a comment during the American Revolution. He had read the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson's opening line, men are created equal. And he looked at America. He goes, why is it? He probably cocked his head. Why is it that those who squawk the loudest about their rights and privileges being lost to Parliament are those who hold a whole society in bondage? And so there many, Washington and Jefferson particularly knew, and they could feel it in their bones, that this was hypocrisy. Many knew it would, and yet did not, and Jefferson particularly did not have the courage to buck it further. It takes a unique courage to tell your neighbors, we're wrong. And to be honest, we have to remove this blight. Not the people. The people are not at fault. They were dragged here, some kicking, screaming, and the survivors enslaved. You know what we did, kind of thing. And then you have to deal with that issue. Some of the Quakers were the first the Christian churches to actually really formally say slavery is a morally foul thing. God forbid that we continue this. May God forgive us for the sin of this. And they're the first ones to use that religious language and say, this is so utterly wrong. And it screams at you because you read your own documents. And Douglass loved, he did honor the Constitution, the ideas of the founders. But his argument was to live up to it. And even later on, when Martin Luther King Jr. would talk about this, he said, the documents are good. The ideas are good. But carrying them out stinks. The practice really sucks, but you got the right idea, but you're not getting it. You're not doing it. Of course, maybe it's like reading the Ten Commandments or the Sermon on the Mount. The ideas are flawless, but boy, I ain't living up to it. And that is kind of where we're at in many ways. We don't want to throw out the ideals and recognize that, it was it is hypocritical, or can't talk. It was hypocritical um, of the founders, and it is of us in our own day and age when and then Douglas in early 1850s, he was asked in New York to give a speech. What is the 4th of July to me? And what is your 4th of July to me? And it argues that I have no place to honor the 4th of July right now because I'm not part of it. And I think every group that comes in here, which is treated shabbily, unfairly, unequally, has a right to say the same thing. Okay, here's your document. Here's your political gospel. Live up to it. I've come here. I'm living here now. I was thrown out of my own country. I'm a refugee. I have no place to live. There is a natural human right to try and find a better life for yourself. The English even believed that during the midst of the Revolution, they didn't feel right about stopping immigration to the United States, even when they're at war with the United States, because they still felt there was a natural right to self-protection. If everything else has gone wrong, gone bad, you have a right to try and make a life for yourself, particularly when you're expected you could die. You're in such dire circumstances, even economically or in crime or war, to find a better place for yourself and your family. That should be one of the most universal earth of a human right on the planet. No one should have to be expected to sit and die comfortably in their own home. That just is absurd. And
All right.
sorry.
Yeah, please go. No.
You got to give me a cutoff point. You got
No.
there or something. I'll keep going. So when somebody has commented, it comes earlier that it is so important that we recognize and separate some of the personal lives and inconsistencies of our politicians and many of our particular founding generation, the men and women who would construct the framework of the documents and the first cases, the first practices with, okay, the documents say this, but then even the founders knew that this was supposed to grow. It had to grow. The Constitution was never meant to be a static, one time fits all. You have to grow into it. It is not sacred text. It has to be expanded upon. And they knew that. That's why it's written in a vague pattern, designed that as the nation grows, as it evolves, and as other people come into it, it's going to have to grow. And to say that, well, some people, they can never be, I hate to use this term, like us, or they can never really be Americans because they were Catholic. Catholics were said that you could never be Americans if you're Catholic because you can never really think democratically, because they're always going to be honoring the Pope. Just stop that silliness. Just stop it.
And then, anyway, if we think now, if we know the story, we can understand why they have that kind of feeling. Because, of course, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, is not in England, it's in Rome.
Yeah.
So we understand the kind of the shake-off that have been between the Anglican Church and people coming from the United Kingdom or coming from Northern Ireland, and why they might have that feeling. Anyway, that is by the way. So for Frederick Douglass, how did he rise to prominence? At what point can we say, yes, he is a leader? Yeah.
By the time he comes back from England in about 49, he gets a name for himself 39, throughout the early 40s, speaking at abolitionist movements in the North, Massachusetts, New York. New York is a very powerfully influential state, and it's a pretty radical state. A lot of wild ideas come out of New York, and they float around a lot. So there's a lot of, and it's the newspapers. Douglas becomes a newspaper editor in, I think, 49, the Northern Star. He starts a paper. He upsets Garrison very much because it's a rival paper to his. But then he argues with Garrison over two things. One, his relationship with Julia Griffith, because well, that's part of it. That's used as an excuse. And then Douglas also goes political on him. Douglas believes in using and pushing the political system. He is going to push the parties to behave right. He's going to push politicians to put their money where their mouth is, and to really, it's okay. You believe in this. All right, let's see you vote, maybe. Let's see you do something coherent on this. And so he is pushing, and Garrison has no use for the government at all. He, in fact, burns a copy of the Constitution at one time. He says it's a document made in hell. He follows politics, but he says he's unpolitical. Quite a strange character in his own right. But the use of the words, publications make Douglas a very famed person. And by 1850, when particularly as abolition gets its really big kick with the Compromise of 1850 and the expanded Fugitive Slave Act, this makes Douglas's words, front and center. And that's without podcasts. This is without TV. This is without Democracy Now! Or PBS, MSNBC or Fox. This is huge. So I would say 50, he's big. When Lincoln becomes president, Douglas is now in his 40s or so, about 10 years younger than Lincoln. Douglas is a main protester, and he is a thorn in Lincoln's side, but it's a thorn that Lincoln welcomes, because Lincoln knows he doesn't know what's going on. He understands, but he also sees in Douglas, this guy is going to look right at me and he's going to tell me what he thinks, and I'm going to hear full strength, full force. And he reads Douglas's words, and Douglas is just as good as Lincoln with writing. He is just as much a wordsmith. He has all the King James backing. He knows the stuff, and he's actually probably more polished than Lincoln in speaking, because Douglas has worked very hard to improve his speaking ability so that he does not sound regionalized. He has something that is unique and powerful, and he has that wonderful voice, that a drama voice, good for radio. He has that great radio voice. So and I think Lincoln really admires this, and probably even envious, because Douglas is really good. But Douglas is an activist. Lincoln is a legalist. Lincoln has never been an activist. He worships law and order. But it's through the two of those, the Douglas, the activist, and Lincoln, the legalist, that you form real change. And you need both those guys. Men and women who can represent both those forces are essential if you're ever going to have a real change, because you have to have the law to put things in place. There has to be some legal pattern, because if you try and go through a revolution, revolutions can't be controlled. Revolutions go where you won't want them to go. They take on a life of their own, and they could destroy everything around you. Whereas if your revolution is controlled in a legal pattern, or you create a new legal pattern for your revolution, you hopefully control the drastic changes that have to take place. But you need both those personalities. Now, how I got over there, I'm not sure. I just kind of wandered over to that theme.
All right. Thank you for that. Now, if we say Frederick Douglass was fighting for freedom, say to be for the African American, for the underprivileged member of the American society, what kind of freedom was this? What was he actually fighting for?
He also agreed in women's rights. He was at the Seneca. He was at the famous Seneca Falls Convention in 48. He was a friend of some of the people there. I think he knew Lydia Childs. So he knew some of these people. They're all, well, remember, 1830s and 20s, 30s, and 40s. This is the great sisterhood of reform. The people on the boards were in the boards of prison reform, abolition, temperance, women's rights. They were all mixed together in the same friends family network. So it's quite a mixture that Douglas was part of, and I think that's also maybe how he gained some more fame, because he is part of this huge network of activists and reformers. But Douglas's idea of freedom, even though I said he doesn't really embrace women's rights at the time, because he knows that voting can only come one thing at a time, because he knows Americans are such a conservative, stagnant lot sometimes. They will not move. And he says, give at least the black men their vote first. We'll get the women in as soon as we can, and so there's a break with the women's rights movement because they've had enough too. They're tired of this as well. But Douglas is seeking both, not just economic equality, not just political equality, equal before the law, as you said earlier, but he is looking at social equality. I don't know, and in fact, he does take on a real serious social equality where he actually marries a white woman, so that there is indeed this social equality, that I see a person, that these are my intimates, even though even though other differences might be there. He is looking ahead toward that. That is the hardest one that I think where we have still the problem now. We kind of play with it because we have this semblance of equality, but in many cases, if you're too different, and it may not be so much a color thing, but cultural thing as well. Like I said, race and culture are intermixed a lot. They don't always mix. I remember having the most delightful conversation with a gentleman from Kenya. His English was terrible, and I spoke no language of his at all. But we were both evangelicals, both Christians, and we had the most lovely conversation. I cried saying goodbye because it was just 3 hours of just deep talking back and forth of our interest and mutual loves and interests. We had a spiritual bonding in that moment, despite the fact that we came from very different backgrounds that overcame that. We're constantly having to find those moments where we overcome the baggage, that the baggage, whether it be culture. It's what was I taught as a kid? Oh, watch out for that person, watch out for that guy in the uniform, whatever it was. We have to get past the baggage, and that's at an individual level, but then it's also at a full-scale social level. And I think this is what we're fighting at now. Years ago, the Promise Keepers was trying desperately to get over the personal level, but you still had to get over the social group levels as well.
The person we are talking about today, of course, is Frederick Douglass, and we're talking about him because of what he have done in the course of his lifetime. But of course, he's no longer here with us.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for ordinary Americans, how do they see this historical individual? What do they think of him?
A lot of folks have forgotten him. If you're taking a survey course now, for example, I've got the book David Blight, on Frederick Douglass's biography, and I'm sure his students and students at Harvard or Yale they're getting plenty of Douglass. And my students, I make them read a Douglass piece as well, some of his autobiography, as part of their general readings, even in a survey course. I think many still don't really grasp him enough, although I'm seeing it slowly build up. I think my old museum, we had a Frederick Douglass actor who came in and would portray Douglass, the older Douglass, of either the Civil War or post-Civil War era, trying to reintroduce people into what did Douglass say. What we're having a hard time now is going back and what did Douglass write? Douglass was a writer and a well-known writer, and we need to go back to his autobiographies because they're also a treatise on what it means to be equal, what his ideas are of equality and self-improvement and taking your part, a responsible part in society. He was, that's the message I think we need to bring back or help folks, catch on to that one. we often see Douglas as an abolitionist, and I think it's a little. Most people don't really know it that well. They think of as an abolitionist. If they know Civil War, they know he met Lincoln a couple times. They'll know that part. But they don't realize his later life. He's still an activist. Yes, his young life, we see him growing and becomes famous, well known. In his older life, he's still this somewhat irascible, but challenging activist, pushing us to a much higher level. And we're just not willing, I think, often to listen to somebody speak prophetically, I use that word carefully, to push us to our higher levels, the ideals that we make claims to. Douglas is arguing, come on, live up to it. You got the instruction book, follow it. So I think that's what we're missing. We're not doing that enough. And I think people miss that part. They know his name and they recognize his face. His face is very well known. Any school kid, oh yeah, that's fine. We know who he is. But to know what he said and what he wrote is a little more missing. We have Lincoln down pretty good, but Douglas is a little bit more missing, I think, in a larger group, a larger society. I think that's a loss.
Why is that a situation? Is it like, does it relate to what we were talking about before when we were looking at the configuration of the United States as a society, where some individuals believe that they are the real Americans, every other person is irrelevant. For this reason, even though you might have made a contribution, we will deliberately ignore you. Is that why?
I think that is a part of it. I don't know all of it. A lot of it's because we don't teach history often or well. Most of my students will get a simple survey course and they'll never have another one again. A few museums will tackle this issue and bring Douglas out. The museum is probably the more valuable component to reintroduce everybody to Douglas, as well as, what you're doing here, podcasts. Podcasts are an important new young component in public history because more folks will see this and they'll see it after the event. They'll be watching this several years down the road. And hopefully when they hear something like this, they'll say, okay, what's Frederick Douglass' autobiography? Oh, there are 3 of them? Dang, let's go back and look at those. Or look at his dedication speech to the Freedmen's Monument in Washington, D.C. Some of his speeches about the Chinese Exclusion Act, where he critiques that issue. His actions as a minister, a government employee. So he is, it's a pretty wide-ranging career. But I think we have to go back to his words. And that's the missing component. We need to go back to his words, like we did Lincoln's, and go back at him again from a fresh, hundreds of years, well over 100 years later, and say, okay, Douglas spoke here then. How does that reflect us now? Now, how have we done so far? Kind of use it as a measuring guide. How have we done so far? Oh, well, maybe not too good in this area. Maybe better in another area. Douglas was very strong about this one. And he said these things in the midst of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was already starting up in the 1890s. He saw the lost cause myth being built, where the Confederacy was rewriting their own history to write slavery out of the entire Civil War package. And so Douglas needs to be brought back for that reason as well, because he does not, he is very critical of that particular component. He wanted us to remember what that war was fought over, because that also goes back to what he talked about throughout his young life. That this is indeed, the cause of the war. Slavery is indeed this piece, and that legacy of slavery carried through. It didn't go away. It didn't just because the system died down doesn't mean the patterns, the behaviors, the prejudices died down as well.
Perhaps it had been reformed. People always look for a way to reform the situation. The criminals also have a way of reforming their crime. So you don't look at it as a crime anymore. It becomes normal to you.
Mm-hmm.
Only that the person who is suffering from the crime know that this is something that is hurting me. But if his point of view is not the one we are interested to hear, we will never know that it is painful. We will always see the rebranded criminality that have become a way of life.
Yeah.
Where it hurts. Anyway, what would you say was the biggest challenge or some of the biggest challenges of Frederick Douglass as he tried to find his way around in the society?
Well, in his early years, think about this. Abolition is illegal. If you escape slavery, you have been enslaved. You are charged with theft. Remember, you do not own the body you live in. It is not yours. It is its master's. Therefore, when you leave, you're stealing. Grand theft person, so grand theft auto, this is grand theft person. That means you are criminally wanted. The North is no less racist than the South. Personally, you have the same personal prejudices. Irish immigrants in New York despise African American neighborhoods. Absolutely hate them. There is no great love lost there. If only they could have merged because they solved some of their same problems together. Being being an underclasses. Why don't we bond together and vote as a block? Come up. No, that was not possible. So, if you are a person who has escaped, you know that at any time there might be a posse sent up from places long you tried to forget. And if you were an escaped slave, it means you have been abused at one time or the other. You have been treated. You've seen violence. Now, even Ona Judge, who was Washington's slave when she escaped, now she was treated surprisingly well, but she knew that very shortly she would be sent to another family who didn't treat people well. And that made the panic, that made the thing, okay, either you do or don't now, and she decided, I'm jumping ship. And she was poor her whole life, but it's her life. So, but you have to get that point of saying it's worth the tremendous risk of being caught. And if you're caught, you will be tortured. You will be maimed. You may likely be killed just out of spite. Anybody around you could be killed. So that your life is you're a felon on the run, and you know that any white person around you could turn you in, and so you become insular. You're with your own communities. They will guard you. They will hide you, and if need be, send you on to Canada, the land of the free and home of the brave. In fact, there was a great letter by an African American family, escaped, went to Michigan, went to Canada, wrote a letter back to his master telling how things were in Ontario. He ended the letter with, God save Queen Victoria. This land of the free and home of the brave. So that's the person. Douglass has to deal with this. So from his escape as a teenager, through his working on board ship, any labor work he's done, even after he meets Garrison in 1839, all through the 1840s, even going to England, he knows he's wanted. Not until that group from England decides they get the money together and they kind of force, basically, it's kind of a bit of paying the blackmail off. They buy his freedom and get his official papers that he's free. Can he go back? Can he travel the United States? But he can never go south. He can't go back to Maryland until well after the Civil War. And when he goes there, it's kind of this, he has to exercise the demons from his own past by going back to the plantation where he grew up. a place of cruelty. It's like me going back to grade school, a place of cruelty and horror. I had a bad grade school. Not that bad, but he had to go back to places that he hated in order to kind of. So that's an interesting way of living your life. He's going back to this, the work camp, the plantation, the work camp where he was, where he watched people tortured. As a little kid, he watches one beaten nearly to death. The cruelty, that horror cruelty was epic. And you live with that. So I think living with the knowledge of that cruelty is scarring. Similar to what Jews who endured the Holocaust, even though they escaped, still dealt with that profound level of cruelty on people they would have known, people that vanished. Anyone who's had to live with that's probably one of the more difficult things you have to work through as a challenge in your personal life, because you have to keep living through that. Even though those folks were and imagine he would see them later on. He would see people who were cruel later on in his older life. This is a hard moment to share, and to see perhaps see the ambivalence of other Americans in the North who did not believe it was that bad. Perhaps they said, well, they get on to the later 1880s and 70s, and they think maybe the Civil War was a waste. But why should we have done this? Was the South right? And he has to listen to this all over again. Says, no, this was the right thing to do. It had to be done. We had to do it.
That's a price. That's a price to be paid.
That's the price you pay.
You use the term cruelty in your explanation just now, and before that, you have used the term body, and you said something to the effect that at the time of enslavement, the enslaved people were not the owner of their body, and of course, that is a testament of what has happened. And so that the later time when you are using the term cruelty, it should be clear to people what we are talking about here. We're actually talking of genocide. People who have suffered genocide with many genocides, several of them. All right, and because the people we are talking about now are people from Africa, and therefore they are children today, are the children of African descent. Now, those who did that to them were European, and therefore the children of the American today, or the real America, the way they would like to call themselves, are the children of the slave master. Now, when you look at the conversation that is going on in the United States, do you think that these children, who are the offspring of their father, think that what their father did to the African Americans, and therefore the children that are now bearing the epigenetic trauma, is wrong? Like, do you think they have it in their consciousness that their father did something wrong?
Depends. An example of that. When I first started in museums, I was trying to get into a plantation museum, and I'm glad I didn't, because I didn't really have a deep enough a history background to grasp what the plantation really was. It's a work camp. There are one or two plantations museum plantations, and they interpret slavery as it was. They go into it. They don't glamorize it, but they interpret it as a work camp that by its existence is cruelty. It does not matter that maybe a particular plantation owner, said, I will never sell break a family apart. I'll never do this, I'll never do that. The fact is, the system itself puts you in a no-win scenario. You didn't own yourself. You could not, control yourself. Even ancient slavery wasn't this cruel, but this is slavery on steroids, because all of a sudden the slavery becomes a profit margin. It becomes part of the capitalist system, international trade and marketing, advertising, it's got a lot of money attached to it now. It's no longer just a cultural status. And because you can be physically identified quickly, if you use race slavery as your definition, you can be recognized, fairly quickly, because I don't look like you, you don't look like me. One of us must be different, you mark them off that way. That's why Native American slavery didn't work, because they could hide, they could go into the society of the natives and you couldn't find them again. You're not going to just see them. Excuse me. So slavery is a system, and I don't know, there are some who look at their family history, if they know it, and they say, we owned slaves. That should be a bother. Now, I know when I lived down south, that happened a lot. And there was this really awkward relationship between the families, because we had families of the same name, one African American, one white. And that's when I got exposed to what happened. And I go, oh, I suddenly realized that actually they're second cousins, they're related to each other. And you didn't talk about it because there was so much hurt tied into that, because the hurt didn't end in 1865. It continued into the 1890s and the 1900s and then the 1920s and 30s and 40s. And in the 1960s, it continued, the exploitation in some form or fashion, whether it be physical, sexual, economic, all these forms of exploitation were still used at times, because you didn't really control your society as much. You didn't have full equality before the law. Even if it was technically there, it wasn't there. Equality before the law has to be enforced. There has to be somebody outside saying, oh, no, this court's wrong. You have to treat them correctly. You didn't treat them correctly. There has to be a force, that checks and balances that we have has to be used in dealing with race relations, cultural relations, as well as just economic. You have to kind of have a check on that as well. And that's we still haven't gotten that check down right. I think we still can't quite grasp how to manage that one. I think I know there are those who try and deal with the issue of slavery in their family past differently. Some universities have, for example, I think UVA, some others, they have gone online. They've tried to divest themselves or renamed things. The monument renaming we're going through now is the U.S. Army has tried to change the name of bases because they don't want to revere a Confederate Army officer who may have been a good Army officer, but he tried to destroy the United States. Why should a base be named after him? Race relations are tied into that, because those two events kind of get plugged together very closely.
All right. I have a curiosity again, because it's part of the circumstances that led to what Frederick Douglass did. That is why I'm sort of trying to point out some of these things. It's not really like we are treating the argument of slavery, as it were, but of course, it's a central piece of what led to what Frederick Douglass did. He was born in it and he fought against it. So it is important in his life. So that's why. Today, 2023, how is the conversation around race and slavery in the United States? What I mean is that, is it an open conversation, something that you could easily talk about, or something that where we don't want to touch it, let's leave it there, it is a forgotten thing? Because really, nothing is forgotten.
Yeah. Okay.
So help me with that.
Depending on where you're standing. Right now, I'm noticing battles like, for example, Florida, Texas, which are big textbook states. They're now I think there's some denying of this, but they're trying to backpedal on advanced courses that deal with African American history. To understand slavery, you really have to go into, and actually racism in general, you have to almost do a micro focus on, okay, how did people who of African descent get into this country? What happened to them? What are some of the communities they formed? We look into the pre-communities in the Midwest and in the South and in the North. The Harlem Renaissance, for example. Those are stories that we look at just African American history, kind of focus in on them, and then figure, okay, how do I now weave that story into the overall story when I do a survey of American history? And that's where the battle is going on right now. A lot of times, and I think it came about as a counteraction to the 1619 Project, which it has some of its own problems. I'm not real thrilled with as far as how they, some of the themes and essays they had, but it forces everyone into the conversation about African slavery. How did it evolve? Why did it evolve? And then how did it keep going? So that conversation is not going well, I would bluntly say. The university I work with right now has been very, very supportive of the historians just being blunt and teaching the material. We go into the hard questions, the consistent racism issues, not just with African Americans, but Native Americans, with other immigrant groups. Dealing with these are problems that we've had consistent issues with. We have never fully resolved them, and sometimes we seem to go backwards and forwards. Right now, we're seeing where some states are becoming more restrictive on what you can teach. And having been a high school teacher at one time, I would not have done well with somebody telling me, I need to see your books, and I need to vet your books. I said, excuse me, I can vet you. I says, I don't take advice from the librarian what books are history, in my collection. I am not going to take advice from you on that one. I'm pretty arrogant about that one. I spent too much time on this, over 40 years of the study. However, to be told that, well, you're going to have to tone down to discuss slavery. You're going to have to not bring up, or you've got to take more time on Henry Clay, and they kind of ignore Harriet Tubman, and just mention Douglass here, but don't talk about him in the 1880s. It says no. I know the field, and to be told because of political sensibilities that you cannot teach certain things at a certain level, I'm opposed to that. But that is what we've got. We're seeing it. It's many times I see activists argue that, well, perhaps we're just trying to keep. We don't want kids to hate them. Be told to hate themselves. I said, no one is telling kids to hate themselves. But you look at the issue and you have a mixed race, and I have it in some of my classrooms, and I just relish the moment where I can bring them in. Okay, what do you feel about this? Now, many of my kids who are African American, they grew up in an upper middle class neighborhood, so they have not had any personal emotional experience with racism. My good friend of mine, Fran Brown, was very, her dad was an admiral, in the U.S. Navy. He didn't experience racism because, Fran's dad was in charge. Everybody looked at him. They said, "Yes, sir. No, sir." How far, sir? She had known. She was wealthy her whole life. She didn't have the baggage. Her husband does. He had the baggage. He had the baggage to deal with. So there were these issues that they felt differently. It depends on the personal experiences are important, because it may be that's emotional. I teach Sunday school, and I teach Sunday school in the Near East Side, Indianapolis, and some of my students have dealt with racism at a really horrible level, but they're poor. They're fairly vulnerable in parts of their lives. And so they have suffered and they have baggage. Trust me, they have baggage.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. All of us we are carrying the baggage. But anyway, I was probably this is the last one I'll ask you here before we are moving towards the conclusion. Now, is it? I know we're always going to go back to what we were always discussing before. In that, in the United States, there are people who believe that they are the real people. Every other person is just
Yes.
subordinate. That is why they fit our history in that way. Because if we were to take up Christopher Columbus, I don't think you are saying this is the only thing you can talk about him. You don't need to talk this about him. You don't need to study these years about him. We entirely look at a human being and try to see everything we can learn from him.
Hmm.
If we take out Shakespeare, Shakespeare is not even an American. In the United States, I don't think you are studying just maybe certain years in the life of Shakespeare. You are looking at him as a human being and what he has done. If you think of, I don't know, maybe a Roman emperor,
Mm.
you don't say you are just going to study only this small part of him. You look at him
Hmm.
from when he was a child till he grew up, what he did, because you are trying to find traces of what can you learn from him. So I believe that in the same way, those in charge of the United States should be open to a real conversation. That we really sincerely want to solve the problem of genocide that have been committed in this country. Not pretending it is okay. What I mean is that when you are open for conversation, you can't say let's talk and you are blocking me. You must allow me to talk. Ask me how do I feel? I
Hmm.
also want to know how you feel. Because if you are blocking me, you're also blocking my feeling. How can you block my feeling and you want us to reconcile? Reconcile what? So is it because those in charge of the United States, because that is what we are talking about today,
Right.
are still believing that there are some people who are the real Americans? Every other person is irrelevant, that they are featuring the history like this. For this reason, people like Frederick Douglass are not known in the society that they have fought to build. Help me with that.
Ooh, let's see. How am I going to start with that one? Um, I would say political leaders are by and large not a courageous bunch. Having worked with some politicians in my time and being horrified that they're not all that bright and they're certainly not courageous. And if they're career politicians, they want to maintain that status. So they're not really inclined to challenge their constituents. A little like a pastor who pastors a very conservative nationalist church. He can't say, or she can't say things that are going to offend the congregation because they'll get fired. And I think that's the attitude we've got. We don't want to tick off their constituents. Many Americans, many Americans, when you think of history, go through it with blinders. They see a very limited perspective. And we've done it for quite some time. Our use of social media has only exaggerated that tendency. Um, the old party system we've had for generations has always encouraged that blinkered, limited perspective. And so you really aren't able, it's hard to talk because you have to leave that blinkeredness and talk with somebody who is not like you. I remember having one conversation like that where it had to change me because I asked, how do you feel about this? And I got told, which was healthy because I had to rethink a lot of what I assumed. Um, but I had learned to respect this person because I knew their education background. I knew that they knew things. I knew they were smart and were wise. And that at root, we had the same faith base. And then so I had to really listen to what this person said, even though it was not what I expected. And then I had to rethink my own positions on quite a number of issues because of this deep conversation. That is a conversation most don't have. And politicians are not inclined, I mean, they may have it themselves, but like I said, politicians are not courageous beings, especially in America. They are not, we do not have great courage and certainly not great speaking skills in, in politicians anymore. They don't live like the Henry Clays and even Clay and Webster were not that courageous in their own ways. They would be, and they had their own quirks and weaknesses where they buckled under political pressures. But most, don't have that kind of courage. They really don't want to confront in a system which is very democratic, or at least visually democratic. They don't want to cross their constituents that keep them in office. And now we're looking at constituents who are looking very likely at using force, violence to express their opinions, which to me, that goes back way back to the 1830s and 40s when we had riots in the cities over any political issues. And we called it politics out of doors. And that's where people would take their anger out of doors, and a protest would become a riot very, very quickly, and could cause an awful lot of damage very quickly. And I think there is a nervousness in that. We saw that a few years ago. And so now we're looking at this happening again, and it is not an encouraging thing. I'll be honest, I keep watching, when I watch C-SPAN and I see congressional and Senate debates going on, I keep thinking back to Dr. Joanne Friedman's book, Field of Blood, where she talks about violence in Congress. I thought, okay, when's the next fight going to break out? When am I going to, so I have my journal ready to write down, oh, there was a fight break out, when's this going to happen again? And it comes back to that we're not talking to one another, we're talking at one another. Because I'm not going to offend my constituents by talking with somebody else and making them talk. That's even harder. It's hard enough to do it yourself. It's much harder to tell the people who voted you in or who pay your salary, no, you need to talk to the other person as well, not just me. That's systemic. And that one requires, that's a Douglas thing. That's a Douglas act. That's a gutsy thing. That's the prophet. Okay. That's the prophet talking there. You have to say, look, I'm going to talk to somebody who's different, but I'm going to drag you along with me, and you're going to do it too.
Thank you for that. All right. Looking at the person of Frederick Douglass, what would you consider to be his greatest achievement and true legacy today, 2023, as we look back at his life?
If I was to do a Douglas exhibit, remembering Douglas, like we do with Lincoln, I would focus in on what he said about others, the others. That there is no such, we should have no other others. We basically come in as Americans. I would try and put together the idea he saw, live up to your words, guys. Live up to the Declaration, the opening lines, the Declaration of Independence. Live up to the preamble of the Constitution. Live up to some of the great letters and documents and essays in the Federalist Papers. Live up to these things. These are some marvelous terms and words that have impacted the world. But there's only hypocrisy, and it's offensive to many others when you don't live up to them. There are others in other countries who've done much better, I think, sometimes in living up to those things than we have. At different times. I think that is one thing that it looks worse when you do not live up to your own rhetoric. This is something that we have to do much better at. And this is what I think, if I was going to construct a Douglas exhibit, it's his comment to live up to those glorious words, live by them. And what he did to actually live, example for the, getting married to a white woman in his later years, trying to demand, no, we're going to be equal socially too. We're going to be one society. We are not going to have this, they're just not like us. Don't stop that. I mean, he did it though. What I love about Douglas is that he posts this social equality, but he does not lose his Christian faith, from what I can tell. And as a Christian myself, I find that very helpful, encouraging, that you maintain faith, and yet also this great belief in the equality of all humanity.
Now, I've asked you almost everything I wanted to ask you. So what would be your final thought here? Maybe it might be a message, or it might be, I don't know, something you wanted to say that I didn't ask you. So please go ahead and conclude it in your own way.
I want so much bring up, I can show a book, I guess. I would encourage getting a collection of Douglas writings, and they're available everywhere, even online, or one of the new biographies on Frederick Douglass. And I would sit down and say, okay, I need to know this person. I need to be introduced again, or for the first time, to this guy. And I need to look at the awkward life, the challenges, the pains he had to suffer, the difficulties he went through. And then I want to read his words again and look at, okay, what does this mean for me? How can I recycle this? How can I reuse these great words that meant maybe one thing in the Victorian age? But then, like Lincoln's words, we take them again and says, how do I need this now? How would I rephrase this in this century? I get to the 21st century. How do I rephrase this now? So that, oh man, now it's meaningful. Now it's speaking to me in 2023. It's speaking to me now in this age. But you have to go back and look at the biography and look at his words. And I would encourage folks to go back and pull those out. David Blight did this great book, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom. I thought it was a great book for that one. I think it's the new one out. It's by a renowned historian. And that's a good way of looking at his biography. Oh, there we go. There's a way of grasping this character. It's a big book. It's not a little book. Pull it out here. Here we go. Not a little book. Not a little book. But I think we have to get past the Reader's Digest or the Cliff Notes versions of everything. We're going to have to take risky dives into material, spend some time. And I think Frederick Douglass is one of those characters that, okay, I need to spend time with Douglass. And I need to spend this time seriously looking at and thinking about my age through this guy's life, and looking for lessons that I can pull out and make sense, maybe, or things that I can take back with me into my world and living now.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the conversation. I really learned a lot from what you have shared with me. I really do appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewafo. Thank you so much for listening, and talk to you in the next episode.